Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming one of the country's finest fiction writers and the undisputed master of the literary arts, Miss Antonya Nelson.
Thank you. That was very sweet. Hi. Thank you very much for that very nice intro, and thank you for having me here. I thought what I would do is talk about the ways that the material of the world, for me, has places in writing that it gets channeled. And only recently, within the last couple of years, have I been writing personal essays. I've written a lot of nonfiction that isn't about me, that's about writers and about the craft of writing. But I was asked by Texas Monthly to begin being I think they called it writer at large, which is sort of I like that term anyway, but a writer at large. And so given that chance to write in the first person more frequently has been an interesting process for me, because all the material that's available to me is the same material in my life that I would channel into some sort of fictional enterprise, but I now have this other avenue, this other place I can put information or stuff or arrange it in such a way that it comes out differently. So it's been nice for me to be able to have yet another place, another way to approach the world. And I want to talk about the differences, or how material might suggest to me either that it needed to be an essay or that it's better served in fiction, or the methods I would use to decide which genre to put a piece of my life into. But I thought maybe I'd start by reading a nonfiction piece, a personal essay that appeared in the Texas Monthly, and then we will have some sort of something in common rather than my abstract chatter to refer to. So this essay, I don't remember what the Texas Monthly titled it. Magazines tend to disregard my titles. I just titled it How I Got a Tattoo. "This your first tattoo?" the artist asked. Already I felt uncomfortable. 46 years old. It was literally my 46th birthday, hanging around at a place that I had so hoped would resemble a doctor's office. But that, instead, resembled the skanky apartments of slacker boyfriends from college, replete with ripped pleather couch, sophomoric posters, and foul incense. Not dull Golf Digest on the waiting room table, but magazines called Pain. His question gave me further pause. To me, it was akin to somebody asking the bride on her wedding day if this was her first husband. I mean, how many did a person need? Husbands, tattoos. Yet I was, after all, getting a tattoo around my wedding ring finger. It was, as tattoos go, more matrimonial than most. The route to this tattoo is lengthy and digressive, and I'll try to tell it clearly. My father always said the women in our family didn't think in a straight line, and therefore our stories were not stories. They had no plot, were instead like roads that dissolved into dust, or fell off bridgeless at the river, or like some rococo lawn ornament, pointless in addition to being ornately bejeweled with the irrelevant and unbecoming. The reaction they drew was often a deaf ear. My father could literally turn off his hearing aid. Or at best, a thought balloon with a question mark inside it. So, in the beginning, there was a word. The word came from a book by James Salter. The book is Light Years, and the word is inimitable. I love the scene where the word appears. In it, Salter's husband character has just come back from his first tryst with another woman. Meanwhile, his wife has been at their lovely country home drawing pictures of eels all afternoon. She wants her husband to write a story about the eels, something to show to their little daughters. He laughs at her, still giddy from his illicit lovemaking in the city, and tells her that eels are very Freudian. She claims that the symbolism is tediously narrow, and moreover, dislikes intensely the word he uses to explain the symbol, cock. I hate that word, she says. He asks her, what one do you like? She replies, inimitable. I have to clarify, she doesn't think that inimitable is a substitute for cock. She simply prefers it as a word. Me too. Boy, howdy. I prefer it to a lot of other words. In fact, I may prefer it to all other words. Hence the idea of having it tattooed upon myself. I'm a writer. I'm an individual. I like to think of myself as unique. Everyone thinks they're unique, said my daughter recently. Everyone thinks he's unique, I corrected. As a wordsmith who likes to think of herself as unique, the word inimitable, as applied to me, to my body, seemed perfect. And it seemed that way for a few years, more than a few. Enduring as it did, I decided finally to have the deed done. Here I feel a need to digress. Maybe 8 years ago, I met the author of Light Years at a cocktail party in Albany, New York. He accidentally sat on my purse, so I saw that as a particularly opportune moment to accost him. It's fine, I assured my literary hero when he apologized for crushing my black bag. He said he hadn't stolen anything from the purse. Ha, ha, ha. And I told him in one big gush that he was more than welcome to anything in there he wanted. The Xanax, the maxed out credit cards, my son Noah's London tube pass I'd saved because his photo was so sweet, the birthday candle from the 80s, the fortune cookie fortune from my last date with my dead boyfriend, the broken cigarettes I secretly smoked, the spray bottle of elk urine I shoplifted from a hardware store in Phillipsburg, Montana. All of it. Whatever. Just because later I could say that he, James Salter, had taken them. Understandably, Mr. Salter was backing away from me as I rambled and blathered, looking desperately around at the table of literary notables for some help in escaping me. As a group, Russell Banks, William Kennedy, Frank McCourt, they seemed to shrug. Good luck, buddy. Poor James Salter, stuck with his starstruck fan who had just enough to drink to feel like telling him all about her idea for a tattoo, based on a scene from one of his novels. And, as her father had always noted, no idea how to properly frame a story, beginning, middle, end. I imagined the word set in old-fashioned type font, the kind that Remington or Olympia typewriters used to produce. In black ink, it would appear on my back, or perhaps the nape of my neck. Inimitable. And could I have swiveled around to show my backside to James Salter and the whole table of literary luminaries and pointed at the place just above my tailbone, that spot where my blouse untucked from my skirt, where I imagined the tattoo resting? God, I hope not. But I fear the worst. I am that kind of drinker. However, years passed, and then tattoos got so popular. Everyone was sporting them, not just bikers and bad girls and grunge rockers, but lawyers and grandmas and Republicans. Even my rebellious teenage daughter thought they were too gauchely pervasive to consider, she of the pierced lip and shaved head. And I've never wanted to do what everyone is doing. It's against the whole principle of inimitable, no? My life has been one of constant divergence from the popular line of thought, often to my own disadvantage, frequently just to be contrary, stubbornness encrypted in my DNA. There's not one group I'm a member of that's a majority, except females. I guess there's more of us than males on the planet. Anyhow, I sort of backburnered the whole tattoo idea when it seemed you could pick one up at Walmart along with the rest of this nation of ninnies. Meanwhile, other stuff was going on. In the year beginning in the fall of 2000 and ending in the fall of 2001, several monumental events occurred. First, my husband and I decided we'd have another baby. Everyone in our family loves babies, and our first two had always wanted more. So that became our project, getting pregnant, and although it was more difficult than the other two times, it did happen. Then at 15 weeks, and only a few days after we told our son and daughter that I was pregnant, I miscarried. The children, then 14 and 10 years old, were heartbroken, much more so than either my husband or myself. I wanted that baby so bad, my daughter cried. And my son, who was the only one home with me when the miscarriage began, merely lay beside me on the bed sobbing, grieved beyond words. Next, my husband's 43-year-old brother was diagnosed with ALS, which is perhaps the cruelest disease of all the cruel diseases, leaving its victim with a mind intact, trapped in a body moving swiftly toward total malfunction and death. Up to that point, his brother's life had looked a lot like ours. Children the ages of ours, a career in academia, a world of ideas and art. He had been my husband's little brother, the one he looked out for and confided in forever. The disease, even at diagnosis, this was clear, would take everything from him, every single thing. His brother's wish was that we all travel together that summer. We went to Scotland as an extended family, visiting castles and islands and taking in plays. Never mind that we totaled a rental car driving on the wrong side of the road. Never mind that my brother-in-law was noticeably declining on a nearly daily level. It was the last hurrah, a trip meant to be memorable. And it was there, while we were abroad, that we received news from our house sitter in New Mexico that our home had been vandalized. The degree of destruction was unbelievably high and violent. House paint and motor oil poured on the floors and beds, gang graffiti sprayed on the walls, artwork slashed with knives, our belongings crashed and piled knee-deep throughout, toys, checks, paperwork, jewelry stolen. And the vandals, caught a few days later, were teenage girls, strangers to us, but neighbors nonetheless. They lived literally on the other side of the railroad tracks. The damage they did to our daughter's bedroom was the most alarmingly angry, as if they too understood she was a lucky girl in the world of girls. Their rage at this unfairness was manifest in the way they laid waste to the vast and beautiful array of belongings that had been bestowed upon her by family, friends, circumstance, and sheer luck. And the last thing, of course, that happened in that bad year was the attack on the World Trade Center. To our children, I think that our family, our home, and our country seemed under assault. A certainty about endurance had not been merely shaken, but eroded, and not just for them. When my husband and I married, we bought matching simple gold bands. We wore them for years. Then he broke his ring finger playing basketball, and his had to be removed. A few years after that, my band went down the hot tub drain at the gym. I exercised daily, either hiking or running or moving spastically around on the aerobics floor, and my fingers tend to swell. I'd occasionally lost circulation and been nearly unable to remove the ring, so neither of us had our bands. For a while, we gave each other various rings for Christmas or birthdays, and we wore them when we thought of it, a different one depending on the outfit. Some days, no rings at all. We were married. We knew we were married. Our children knew it. Did rings really matter? After all, everyone who was married wore rings. Rings were, perhaps once again, the opposite of inimitable, right? Moreover, rings don't even look good on my fingers. I have not only very stubby hands, my thumbs are hammer thumbs, inherited from my father. Whenever a Nelson baby is born, everyone grabs the little wrists, relieved to see normal thumbs. Mine? They look like South Park characters. But I also bite my nails. Rings on my fingers are like lipstick on a kindergartner. Amusing, yet obviously all wrong. But when I decided last fall to resign from my job in New Mexico and commit myself fully to one in Houston, I thought I needed to reassure my family that I was still theirs. The tattoo maybe would be a balancing gesture, meant to offset my frequent absences as I commuted 700 miles to work. At any rate, it was just after my resignation at NMSU and just before the spring semester at U of H, on my birthday, which happens to be Epiphany, that I walked into the tattoo parlor with my 19-year-old daughter. It was dusk. The neon advertisement had just flashed on. She knew the artist from her art classes at NMSU. His name was Andy Pants. "Could I call you Dr. Andy Pants?" I asked. "Whatever," he said. "Convince me, if you can, that I won't get Hep C," I pleaded as he led me to his cubicle. He was wearing latex gloves, which seemed medically sound, yet he also had an ugly black narrative winding up his arms and out his shirt collar, the usual arrangements of swords and exotic foliage, skulls and smoke, foreign calligraphy, and unsettling drips and pools of red. But like the hairdresser whose own hair is hideous, he hadn't done his own tattoos, had he? My daughter assured me his work was wonderful. He had, after all, put a large Roy Lichtenstein's Kiss 5, 1964, on her best friend's back. I'm going to try to wrap up this tale now. On my birthday, January 6th, my husband was out of town. This tattooed ring would be a surprise. He was due to come home a week later, and I was leaving the very next morning for Houston. Along with the word inimitable, I also planned to have 2 other little bands, one of squares to represent my son's interest in storyboards and math, and the other a vine, hand-drawn by my daughter in the color that is also her name, jade. The artist settled us down in his little cubicle and made 3 transparencies. "You okay?" he asked, responding to my nonstop, nervous, ironic commentary. "Copacetic," I lied. My daughter sat beside me and took out her drawing tablet, ready to record the event. As a fiction writer, I am both cursed and blessed with having a very active imagination. It generally tends toward the worst-case scenario. In fiction writing, this is called conflict or plot. In life, this is called anxiety or hysteria. I not only feared hepatitis C, but pain, and perhaps misspelling. I made Andy Pants look up inimitable on his computer, just to be sure. I also worry about any irreparable decision, the damage that can't be undone. While I sat with my left hand on the saran-wrapped stand, Andy Pants bent to the task, Jade beside me offering encouragement, I made myself think about other things that haven't been undone, the good things that have come to me and are luckily mine, I hope forever, like a happy marriage, like truly remarkable children, or like a tattoo, I told myself. This one, of a scripted wedding band, inimitable, in brown ink, with a saffron row of little boxes atop it, and a green line that looks more like a monitored heartbeat than a vine below. Of those things, I told myself, I am not so afraid. "Cool," my son said when I showed him the final product. "Cool," said my friends, each then tempted to go get her own. They were surprised and vaguely appalled, as I was, at just how cheap a tattoo is. Andy Pants apologized for having to charge the establishment's $40 minimum. "Tip him," my daughter ordered, costing me another $20. My husband's best friend saw the tat before my husband did. He narrowed his middle-aged eyes. "Inmate," he guessed. "Inimitable," I corrected. And then I had to tell him at great length what it all meant. So that's the essay. So maybe it's clear why that wouldn't be such a great short story piece, because, the aim, I think, of anybody who's writing personal essays, literary fiction, is to get at something that is the truth. But the ways of arriving at the truth are not always through the use of facts. But sometimes, and often maybe, the arrival at the truth is through an arrangement of facts and some sort of, and maybe loosely arranged associative bunch of business. But that actually is a way for me to approach why each of these methods is appealing to me, is that I can arrive at truth. And whether I do that by creating a fictional story or whether I do it by recounting something from my own life, those are just the paths I can take. The ultimate objective for me is always to be able to teach myself something true about the world. And it's the way I've arrived at most of what I know, by reading mostly fiction, all of which is just something somebody made up. It seems sort of remarkable to have it as a kind of religious practice for me, essentially. And I'd be happy to answer questions if you have them, and I'm happy to just kind of babble along if you don't. I would like to know what you would like to hear from me if you do have questions.
With that essay that you just read, did you, when you started that out, did you know how you were going to end it, and kind of like the journey that you were taking, talking about everything else that was going on, or were you discovering it as you were writing it?
Mostly it's the latter, discovering as I'm writing, and that's always what happens with me in fiction or essay writing, and it's why it's been difficult, especially with essays, because editors want to know what you're going to write about before you've actually written it, and they want you to know something you can't possibly know, in my experience of writing, until you've completed the first draft or second or 10th, that you don't actually know what you're writing about. You can say, I have a premise, but I have no idea how it will pan out, how it will end, and nonfiction magazines are not that interested, commercial magazines are not interested in hearing how you don't know what you're doing. So it's been weird to pitch essays for that reason. I do feel like there's a kind of, the shaping device of how I got a tattoo is useful for keeping me on task. And the essay permits me not to have to erect all of that scenery that fiction demands, that you have to have, the setting described, the atmosphere, you have to get people sort of in the mood, in the moment. And what I really like about the form of essay that I've been working on is that sort of sense of the core sample, where I have a topic, and while I can, the core sample that you send into the earth to get a feel for what's all in this one place, never mind whatever else is around it. I like that very much about the form of essay that I've been working on. There's just a sort of topic, go, and it's like 1,000 words later, you're done. And so here, just the process of getting the tattoo permitted me to sort of spiral out, but always keep something on task. And that's never true for me in fiction. That idea of there being this center point that I can always just circle around. In fiction, it's much looser and blanker and scarier in some way. Uh-huh.
I have like a tripart question. First of all, do you have other tattoos other than that one?
I don't.
Did the tattoo issue, other than the story you just formed, did the tattoo issue, was it something of significance other than than what you just related to us? I mean, it seemed like the fashion mode that is going on now, which I know that wasn't your case, but that seems like to build on that, was that ever your issue, or was it just specifically that your story, your relation?
I don't know exactly what you're asking, but one response I have, sort of based on a little bit that I've thought about, is that if you ask anybody, almost anybody, what a tattoo means, there's almost always a story around it, and I think that's just so interesting because I grew up in a family where piercing your ears was self-mutilation. It was just like my mother was horrified. So the idea of tattoos was always very way distant from us. But now that they're so frequently on people, but the stories you hear, they almost always, or at least when I've inquired, there's something really meaningful about people's desire to have that thing on them, and that's really interesting to me. So for me, it's just, I don't know, it means something to me personally, and people often ask if I've been writing with Sharpie markers on myself. It's very tiny.
And then I guess, and lastly, when you're writing an essay of that nature, are you bound by a word limit?
It's usually between 1,000 and 1,500 words, and and it's just kind of nice. I mean, the most recent one I think I wrote for the Texas Monthly was about that talk every parent has to have with a kid at some age about the birds and the bees, and it permitted me to just go back to my little sister asking when we were all kids, grandma, all of us in the station wagon. She's in the way back of the station wagon, and she says, out of nowhere, we probably drive through Texas, she says, "Why are those cows riding piggyback?" And everybody in the car is just like, oh. And so she's handed over the seats, and you see my mother bent to it, and my sister just going, coming back, and all this. And then meanwhile, they're out there just still doing it, But anyway, those kinds of ideas where I then could go someplace with it it's just, I like that about the essay, that there's a kind of fluidity and a more lyrical, in the way of just static situation for writing rather than narrative, which story demands.
Your verbiage seems really lyrical. That's a perfect explanation for it. But I like the part that you said about the essay not having to set everything, that you just get right into it and be done with it, because it seems like I always spend so much time trying to get all that done in a short format as possible.
Yeah.
I really like that. I like that insight. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah?
Did you say that when you're writing fiction that's scary? Did you use the word scary?
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, a lot of this stuff, I was realizing while I was reading this aloud that there's a few stories I wrote that make use of this material, in a sort of singular or different form. Our house was vandalized, really so bizarrely vandalized. We didn't know who had done it, of course, when we first got back, and so we're trying to figure out, was it personal, and if so, who, and for what reason, and why, why was all the liquor still present, but the candy drawer had been, it was just like it didn't, and check stubs had been taken, and our daughter's room was so much worse than the rest of the house. It just was so mysterious to try to uncover it. And in writing a story where I created a cast of characters, and they are not in any way related to my life, but the situation that they go through was, so there's this sort of familiar terrain and pressing situation of the vandalism, and then the fictionalized group of people who have to encounter it, so that I can see the ways that such a thing is universal rather than about me. That is, as soon as I assign she instead of I to the person encountering this, I'm in the process of making fiction. And also, I hope, in the process of inviting somebody else into the situation. And as a result, I've got to do a lot more creation rather than just reference to my own life. There's any number of things that are here that have been developed into stories. My fiction is all about family relationships and entanglements and, domestic trouble. And I hope also, has a similar voice, a sort of irreverence for some of what happens. Even in the worst of circumstances, one does end up laughing at things. I don't know exactly how that works. Anyhow. I don't know if I answered that question. It's a lot scarier getting into fiction. Yes. The answer is yes.
Because I'm never quite clear myself about the difference between fiction and nonfiction. When you write an essay like that, does the I become a character for you?
I think this is when, poets have it a lot, or are clearer, I think, when they discuss their poetry, where they will say, the speaker is, and there'll be either an assumed identity, this is Aristotle, or, this is Bambi, whatever, or the speaker is the poet, who will often introduce a poem by saying, my mother died, I wrote a poem in trying to reconcile and they speak so fluidly about what they can adopt as persona. Well, fiction writers only, the sort of experimental fiction writers permit themselves, the person, the author, to be the character in the work. And so I've found it very liberating, probably in the way that poets find it liberating, to be able to claim different speakers and for that claim to just be automatically present in the essay form, where it isn't in fiction. A second thing I will say is that when I write fiction, I almost always write in the third person. It's one of the sort of default mechanisms of my work in general. Not always, but almost always. 95% of the time, I'm writing in the third person because the pronoun I, for me, is mine, and I have to liberate it in order to write fiction that isn't dependent on me. That fiction does have to create its own characters. In this, I think the speaker is me, and I think that's how it's presented on the page and how it's read, and I think the I in fiction is not meant, in general, to be assumed to be the writer's person. You have author, narrator. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I just like to build on that. So while you're writing, do you feel yourself in that situation, or are you an observer and a commentator on it?
If I'm writing fiction, I definitely...
I mean in your essay.
An essay, I really feel as if I'm talking to somebody. As if I'm relaying, as if somebody has asked me, how did you get that tattoo?
So there's no distance between you as a person and the character that you're presenting?
I hope not. I hope I come off as being who I am,
So then the challenge is to flesh it out. The story's all true? All the events that occurred?
This series of events in the essay, that all is factual. I like to distinguish between truth and fact, however. So I will say it is factual, and I even got all the dialogue is exactly as, and there's not much of it, but this is all it's all quoted absolutely. There's plenty of stuff that doesn't get in here, but yeah, it is all factual.
What are your thoughts on the rising popularity of the memoir as a genre? And why that trend?
It's been debated and discussed quite a lot. And I guess, there's any number of theories out there. I mean, it's probably the same way you would say that reality television has taken over TV. I can't explain why people find it compelling because I don't. So if you find it compelling, I would, ask that you ask yourself why we want to hear. Well, I mean, it's just that your opinion is going to be as valid as mine because I'm not drawn to it. For me, just because it happened to you doesn't mean that it's either interesting or well-crafted. And if people are experience junkies and just want to be exposed to, the worst things that have happened or whatever, fine. But you can find that in fiction. And I have, over the years, been educated on the experience of many, many, many different lives and disasters in an artful form in the genre of fiction. And so that's satisfying to me, plenty. And the thing I don't like about a great many memoirs is how poorly they're written, as if the material itself is sufficient. And perhaps it is for some people. It isn't for me. And I might feel differently if there was some disaster in my life I needed to consult. If there was an instance where something awful happened and I needed to get immediate information from somebody who'd gone through the same thing, I can imagine that I would go to the nonfiction, self-help, whatever aisle and find that thing as a kind of researcher or some sort of validating force. So I'm not actually dismissing it. It's just, for me, the memoir overall, in general, it doesn't attract me particularly as reading material. I don't know. It's not a very good answer. I'm sorry.
You said you write as though someone had just asked you a question. Do you envision your audience? Do you write toward a particular audience, or do you just humankind is your audience?
I'm really, when I'm first writing almost anything, the audience is myself. What is it I would like to read? Because I know for a fact that the world is not out there waiting for me to show up with something. So it has to be interesting and entertaining for me to perform, or I wouldn't bother doing it. So I'm a very picky reader in a few ways, and I try to make the work I'm working on as interesting to me as I can make it, and as surprising to me, which is another way fiction is sort of a scarier enterprise because characters can quite easily end up taking over or doing things that are surprising and sometimes quite scary. I know that sounds... I remember hearing people say that when I was a younger writer and just thinking, you are so full of it. Like you don't have control over your characters, please. But relinquishing that control and permitting characters to do what maybe is the most frightening bunch of business is the way to arrive at something smarter than you are. That.
That's such a great perspective. What better validation could you have than you like what you write?
Well, I don't always like what I write, but I try to write something I like. Like when I'm just constructing it, I make a sentence, and when I'm happy with that sentence, or I wouldn't want to encounter that sentence, I try to get rid of that sentence and find one I'd be happy to encounter. But the idea of being able to plan out or plot where you're going with work, I think, is a mistaken notion for most writers. Even if it's just somebody writing a 5-paragraph essay in their English class, I rail against the outline. I hate the outline because it precludes an idea that defies conscious understanding from the beginning. And the revision and the next revision and 10 revisions later is where the great material is. And you can't consciously know that. It's like trying to tell you, it's like trying to invent a dream. Your unconscious dreams are so much more interesting than anything you could manufacture and lie about to somebody about what you dreamed. Because your real dreams, the unconscious business, is so much more mysterious and interesting. Anyway.
I like what you said about humor being present in some of the most abused, sad situations, but I've certainly found that to be true in my personal life. And then this most recent incident about the state of Nebraska having these...
All those kids.
Yes, these teenagers dropped off, and I find humor in that, and then I'm thinking, Margaret, these are very sad situations for these families, and you're laughing at it, and I shouldn't be laughing at that, but yet there's something just humorous in that whole situation to me.
My friend Karen Brennan, who's on the Fiction Collective, I guess, readership anyway, she and I have been friends for a long time, and her daughter was in a terrible accident about 10 years ago on the back of a motorcycle and was in a coma with a brain trauma. Anyway, I went to be with her, and Karen's 2 ex-husbands were also there. And one was the father of the daughter, and one was the present stepfather of the daughter, but both divorced from their mother. Anyway, the 4 of us were riding up the elevator, and the elevator stopped on one floor so that the men could get off, and they were going to go share a room together, which was already sort of awkward and weird. So her 2 ex-husbands get out, and they go away, and the doors close again, and Karen says, "The really funny thing is, there's only one bed." And I never laughed so hard about something, and there's something about the fact of her daughter being in a coma that made it possible for that sort of extreme emotion on one hand permitted this extreme emotion on the other. It was just she was laughing very hard too. It's just strange. It's a strange truth, I think, about the world, that in crisis there's some capacity. Yeah. Huh?
Yeah, so do you, it seems, I'd like to think that you write about things you know about. I mean, even in fiction. Some people, the school of thought sometimes is, well, let me write about something I don't know about so I can research it thoroughly. I don't like to research. I'd rather write about something I know about. And I think that serves to what you're saying about your characters, too, that, giving them their bounds, or their leap of bounds, as it were, that they can do whatever they want to do, whether it's in character or not.
Yeah.
It's because that's what people do. We act out of character, we do things that are least expected.
Right. And I think maybe the thing that is useful for me to keep in mind is that there's always something about a story, a piece of fiction that is familiar to me, whether it's the emotional state or the physical state, and then there'll be some version of myself in extremis. If I were a person who permitted herself to do, something I did perform, but in extreme, what would then be the end result? And
is
so.
Is it that contemplative, or no? Is it?
I just think I think that's what I would say after the fact. I would be able to identify. There was a time when my son was born. It was the anniversary, the occasion of the first Iraq War. The Scud missiles were all flying over, and everybody at the hospital was watching TV except me. I was going into labor all alone. And so the next days following that, the newspaper was just filled with the war. But at our little hospital in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a nurse had, a few days after I was checked out with my baby, had stolen a baby. And this was a very tiny column at the bottom of the paper, but of course that's the one I tuned into because that was the person I could identify with more than the war. It was just the way I felt at the time. And what was interesting to me in reading the story was that this nurse had taken a twin, which I just thought, well, that was nice of her, sort of. I totally got it, And so I knew I wanted to write about that because I had this kind of emotional investment. Plus, I'd just been at that hospital. It was really, and I had this baby at home. I was like, I could imagine so much of this story. But I also didn't want to put myself in the position of being a nurse or a baby thief. I didn't want to occupy that point of view. I needed to find some way for my experience or my sense of the story to inhabit the story, to be close to it without being a participant, either victim or a villain in it. And so I occupied the point of view of the husband of a woman who hasn't had her baby, hasn't ever had a baby, has been denied this, and rather than set it at a hospital, because I would have had to do research, I sent them to Disney World, where I'd recently been, and there's twins there, and the woman decides she's going to haul off with one of them. And so in that way, I'm in that story. I'm in that story all over the place, but also it's wholly fictional. And that, for me, is the sort of liberating process of investment, but also freedom to invent. And, I'm closer to the point of view of that husband than either of those other people, in a weird way, or the Iraqi War. I have to go now. Is that right?
Okay, a few things.
You have to go now?
I have to go right now. Yeah. If there are...
Let her stay.
Yeah, okay, here's the deal. We have an amazing new publishing center high atop the center building. And so the plan is this, that we're going to adjourn here very shortly. There'll be some books to be bought and signed and all that good stuff. And then at 1:30, you're welcome to join Antonya Nelson for a half hour or so. We have a nice fuzzy atmosphere up there for some questions and informal gathering. And that's the plan. But if there are any burning questions, we can maybe have one more. If not, we'll just kind of wrap things up here. And I want to thank Antonya Nelson for
Thank you.